Well, good evening, everybody. It's kind of strange to be doing this from my study at home. I was kind of looking forward to being in Allegany State Park, just seeing everybody in person. So it's going to be a little different here to kind of try to talk to myself to my computer screen right here, but we'll make the most of it. I'm really excited to see as many people show up. It's really, really fantastic. So as Lon said, I'm currently working as the Senior Director of Science and Conservation for the Tory Peterson Institute of Natural History in Jamestown, New York. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit more, not so much just about the Institute, but really about everything that the Institute stands for and what we all have to offer and why it is so important that we are where we are. And in the meantime, I'm going to try to share my screen with you and see if that works. Let's try that. There you go. It looks like it works for me. Can I get a thumbs up from someone so I can see that it worked on your end too? Oh, perfect. Excellent. Excellent. All right. So, let's actually move your screen out of the way a little bit here. So conservation starts in your backyard, but it does not end there. You know, it seems kind of a no-brainer, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about that because I think it's really important. I think it's really important to realize that conservation, everything leading up to conservation really starts right where you live and right where you are. And it could be wherever you are. But I think that Western New York and the area that we're in, or the area that we should have been in tonight if we were here in person, plays really in a very, very important role. And we all know, and you know, obviously this is a little different right now because we now suddenly have people probably from outside of the region here, so I'm kind of assuming that everybody from around here is somewhat familiar with this beautiful area and the beautiful Allegany State Park. We all have these beautiful, beautiful, beautiful areas out here. You know, Chautauqua County, the whole area around here, Chautauqua County alone is about the size of the state of Rhode Island and has 150 or so thousand people living in it. So you can imagine there's a lot of empty space and there's a lot of greenness in there. There's a lot of really beautiful, beautiful terrain out here. So it's easy to feel like that would be an area that would inspire you. But it hasn't always been that way. And just as much as it's the case here, it's really been the same in all of North America, really. If you look at these pictures, for example, these are photographs from downtown Jamestown area where I currently live. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. And you can see in the top photograph that all of the hillsides are pretty much completely stripped bare. There's not a single tree left standing. So no matter how green the area looks right now, it hasn't really been like that for a long time. These are pictures from, a lot of the top pictures dated 1870s, about 150 years ago. The picture below that is a little bit more recent, but it's also sort of probably in that same time frame, just around the turn of the century, around the 1900 mark. And that's the downtown harbor area in Jamestown, the same area that I just showed actually in my very opening shot right here. So it looks a little bit different. You can see that the harbor is completely filled with floating logs that were floated down the river, down the lakes, and you know that's obviously the result of all the trees that were on the hillsides being removed. So why am I showing you these pictures? Well, it kind of comes down to this man, Tory Peterson. So Tory Peterson was born in 1908, so roughly around the time that all the trees that covered Chautauqua County and Western New York region were floating down rivers and being used for the furniture industry. And he was born and raised in Jamestown, in that same area I just showed you. So I'm assuming, since I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, that most of you have heard of Tory Peterson before. But just in case, Tory Peterson is, in essence, he's a lot of different things, but in essence, he is the inventor of the modern day field guide. This book right here in front of you was published in 1934, and it was the very first time that somebody put his talents and his interests and his knowledge together in a portable pocket-sized book that gave you a way to identify all the birds in the Eastern North America in an easy portable package. Now, in a day where any kind of information you can think of is right at your fingertips, you can just whip out your cell phone and just find just about anything. That doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But at the time, it really was. In 1934, we didn't really have that kind of access. We didn't really have that kind of access to books, to information about nature. And, you know, obviously, Tory Peterson being born and raised in Jamestown, we currently have this gorgeous facility right in Jamestown, the Roger Tory Peterson Institute of Natural History, where we honor Roger Tory Peterson's legacy, all the work that he did and all the work that he left behind. But we also try to continue his really important work of educating people about nature. So our mission really is sort of hinging on three different pillars: art, education, and conservation. And it's really about the combination, the synergy of the three things, because all three things were critical to Roger Tory Peterson's ability to communicate all of his knowledge to people. And, you know, at the most basal foundational level, I would say that his artistic abilities are just unparalleled. If you look at, and go back one slide here, obviously the iconic field guide plays that we've all seen, we're probably very, very familiar with. But Peterson was so talented in so many different art medias, you know, with scratch boards, black and white, inks, gouaches. He did these beautiful, beautiful painterly pieces as well. They're all iconic images that he's left us. They're all based on his interest and his love for nature, his inspiration that he got from nature that somehow got transpired into these beautiful, beautiful paintings. And there's more to it. He wasn't just an artist, he was also a photographer. We have at the Institute massive collections of his original slides of nature photography that he did all over the world. We have at the Institute also his collection of study skins, preserved bird skins, birds that were collected commercially before the Lacey Act was even a thing, before that was even no longer permitted. Collections that were made in the late 1800s that include extinct birds, like, for example, the passenger pigeon. Birds that were used as models for Roger Tory Peterson's field guides, that he used as models to really be pretty scientific in his approach to how he painted his birds for his field guides, so he can communicate natural history information accurately. Now, let me be clear, he was not at all a scientist. He was never trained as a scientist, and in a way, he kind of, to me, seems like the ultimate citizen scientist. He had artistic skills that were absolutely incredibly impressive, but he also had an incredible interest in nature and managed to combine those skills to produce all these incredible works. So that first book that I showed you that came out in 1934, right in the middle of the Great Depression, which is kind of amazing when you think about it, when people were, you know, it's maybe even not that crazy anymore to imagine in this day and age, but during a time when so many people were out of work, or so many people didn't even have money to buy food, suddenly this kid from Jamestown produced a book about birds, and it created this incredible wave of enthusiasm about birding. The first run of his book that he finally convinced Houghton Mifflin Publishing Company to put out was grudgingly put to a print run of 2,000 copies. And Roger Tory Peterson agreed to only receive royalties after the first 1,000 copies sold, because they probably also thought this was not going to be a big seller. And that first run sold out in a matter of a week or so. And if you look at the entire stack of different installments, different editions of the very same book right here, the Peterson Field Guide to the Birds of North and Eastern America, it's still in print. It's a book that you can go on Amazon and still buy. The same book that started in 1934 has been updated several times, and it's still out there. You can still buy it. It's been one of the best-selling works of nonfiction on the planet. Over 10 million copies have sold of this one particular book. So when you think about the kid from Jamestown who produced a book that eventually became in front of 10+ million people and educated them about their backyard, that's very, very, very significant. And of course, it didn't stop with just birds. There are, at this point, you know, I think we're pushing 80 different titles of Peterson field guides right now. So for a generation or a generation and a half, it wasn't just a bird guide. There was a Peterson guide for just about anything. There are bird guides, there are mammal guides, there are fern guides, there are tree guides, there are insect guides, you name it. Not all of those were produced by Roger Tory Peterson himself, but he oversaw the production of these guides, and for a big part of his life was the editor-in-chief of this series. Now, he personally was responsible for several of these books. Obviously, the bird books.
Hey, Twan, real quick. It's Lon. Can you move a little closer to the speaker? It's kind of choppy, and we're not quite hearing it real well. So.
Oh, really? Okay, I'm sorry about
better.
that.
Great, perfect.
Yeah. Is this better?
Yes. Thank you.
Set it right up to the screen here. So Peterson himself not only produced the North American bird guides, but also produced the very first field guide for tropical country, Mexico, the Mexican birds. He produced what in my mind is still one of the very best field guides to wildflowers. And he also produced, together with other authors, the first field guide to the birds of Britain and Western Europe, which is, on a personal level, kind of important to me because that was the very first field guide that I ever owned when I was a kid. When I was inspired to be outside and trying to figure out what kind of birds were living in my backyard, I actually bought myself a field guide from my allowance money. And that was the book that I bought, not knowing that this was Roger Tory Peterson's. So, me personally, it's kind of amazing that I was inspired by a book that was written and illustrated by a person from Jamestown, and here I am now in Jamestown running the Roger Tory Peterson Institute and all their science and conservation efforts. So just to go back to the days before there was a field guide, before there was a Peterson guide. So up until 1934, really the study of backyard nature, the study of natural history was the domain of academics. It was something that was done by people who were associated with museums, natural history museums, or universities. It wasn't something that was done by the general public. So if you had absolutely no idea about birds, for example, and this funky red bird with a mohawk showed up in your backyard, and you had no idea what it was, the only way to really find out what kind of bird it was to collect it, shoot it, or capture it somehow, and then take it to an academic who would then tell you what it was. He would identify it for you. So having a tool available, having a Peterson field guide that actually would explain to you what it was, and using his really clever Peterson identification system to not just identify the birds that just about anybody can identify, like a cardinal, but also the really complicated ones with a very simple visual identification system using arrows and almost semi-cartoonish birds that sort of line similar looking birds together on the same page to make it possible for just about anybody to identify birds in their backyards. That's huge. That was really the first time ever that the general public was actually getting involved in the study of natural history, and that the general public had the ability to recognize these kind of species without having some sort of affiliation with an institute of higher learning. That's a big deal. And like I said before, this is all great, and the fact that Roger Tory Peterson did all this starting in Jamestown, I think, is even more interesting right now because, he wasn't just born and raised in Jamestown. He lived here, he graduated from high school, and when he graduated from high school, went to New York City to become a trained artist to really hone his artistic skills. But at that point already, by the time he left Jamestown, he was already on track to become this great naturalist that he eventually became. So to me, that means that the inspiration that he had for all the work that he did really started right here in town, right here in our backyards. And when you think back to these earlier pictures that I showed you, all the logs floating down the city and the industry and the mills, the sawmills, and all the hillsides being completely stripped of trees, that was kind of the world that Roger Tory Peterson grew up in. So he was kind of living in a pretty booming city at the time, surrounded by progress and economic development, and being inspired by these little pockets of green and these little remnants of nature that used to cover the entire region that were only accessible to him within walking distance. And I recently found out he had a bicycle, so a little bit more than just walking distance, so biking distance. So everything that inspired Roger Tory Peterson to become this incredible naturalist, artist, an educator started right here in Jamestown, and started during a time that Jamestown wasn't exactly a pristine wilderness either. And then you got to think, well, what's so special about Roger Tory Peterson? Well, he was just a kid, as far as I can tell, from listening to all the stories I've heard and reading up and everything that I've learned from people that were related to him or in contact with him. He was just a kid doing the things that kids would do. At a very young age, he was out in town. He loved moths and butterflies. Apparently, the story goes, he managed to get an exemption from the chief of police to be outside after curfew so he can collect moths, because they weren't allowed to be out on the street anymore at a certain age. So here's a picture, the only picture that I know of a young Roger, probably around 1920 or so. doing what he did, doing what he loved doing best. And, you know, when I think about what my kids are doing, they're about the same age. They're doing pretty much exactly the same thing. And their friends are too. They just love being outside and they love to explore. And they love to see everything that's out there. Now, they probably wouldn't be wearing a button-down shirt and a tie doing it, but you know, that was just a sign of the time, I guess. So Roger Tory Peterson was just a kid. He wasn't a superhero. He accomplished so much in his lifetime, but you know, you can think of him as somebody with these extraordinary powers. But when you really think about what he did, he really did what every kid would do at that age, just to be outside and be curious about everything that they're encountering. So if he had any kind of superpowers, I would say that his power of observation is probably number one. And his curiosity, his power to try to somehow satisfy his curiosity and gain the knowledge of everything that he's finding out there. And his art skills, his artistic skills to be able to somehow capture the things that he's seen and learned in his incredible art. So the Roger Tory Peterson Institute of Natural History goes by the following motto: learn it, love it, protect it. And it's kind of a logical sequence of how people get into a conservation ethic. You know, you don't really protect something unless you really care about it. You won't really care about something unless you actually know about it and learn about it, right? So there's a logical progression in these steps about nature, and how you have to learn it first before you start to love it, and then you really feel like you want to protect it. It all seems to make a lot of sense. But a lot of what I'm starting to realize more and more is that we probably need to add another layer to this here. It's see it. I think that a lot of people get the whole learn it, love it, protect it sequence, but a lot of people I don't think really see nature anymore. I don't think they actually even are aware of a lot of the things that are happening in our backyards. And I think we really need to start taking a step back and really forcing ourselves to look a little bit more closely. Life is moving so fast. There's so much going on around us all the time that it's easy to miss the little things that are just right around you. So the intro right here. Yep. So, and actually to go back to this, I want to just do a little sidestep because you're going to be seeing a lot of photographs of animals and plants that are situated on a pure white background. And you know, I'm really interested in using visuals for communication, and unlike Roger Tory Peterson, I can't really draw or paint. I'm really not that good at that. But I love photography, and one of the things that I always really enjoyed was really highlighting the species that I wanted to show to people. And you know, nature photography, obviously, you're often looking for an artistic way to represent a specific scene. But when I'm dealing with trying to teach people about specific animals and plants, often it's really important to be able to show them the whole thing. So a few years ago, I came across this great group of folks that started a project called the Meet Your Neighbors Project. There was Neil Benvey and Claybold, a Brit and a US citizen who were both nature photographers, who started this, this international project of nature photographers where they're encouraging people to start photographing plants and animals in your backyard on a pure white background, kind of using high-key fashion photography. And it's amazing because you can really highlight the kind of things that you walk by otherwise and never even realize that they're there. So it really makes it possible to just take little tiny flowers and just show all their intricate detail and make people really stop and ooh and ah over the kind of details that you otherwise wouldn't see unless you really get down in the dirt, and it suddenly becomes a whole other effort to do that. Little millipedes suddenly turn into these like alien creatures if you look them up close and really see them sort of in their full glory. It's a great tool to sort of communicate all kinds of different concepts in nature. This is a little baby rain frog from the Panamanian rainforest, and I can tell you it's about 2 millimeters long, but if I put it on a matchstick, I don't have to explain that, and it's so much more clear what I'm trying to explain to you. And it can make even the scariest things look really pretty, like poison ivy. You know, you can really use this as a tool, as an artistic tool to kind of communicate a lot about nature. So I've been using this a lot to do field guide type work, just like Roger Tory Peterson did, because it really makes it also possible to sort of align photographs of like species or species that you would like to compare on the same page, just like Roger Tory Peterson did with his bird plates, for example, in his field guide. So I've been using those kind of techniques and that kind of for lack of a better term, art to illustrate all kinds of books and magazine articles and such that I've been working on lately. So to go back to Roger Tory Peterson, I wanted to just give you this quote that he gave us a while ago. Birds have wings, they're free. They can fly where they want, when they want. They have the kind of mobility that many people envy. Now, I have to say this is probably one of the things that is most fascinating to people about birds is that they do have the ability to just go fly. You know, who wouldn't want to do that? But there's some really interesting aspects to this quote that I think are important to realize. It is obviously true that birds have wings and they can fly where they want, and they do. And I think that's a very important thing to realize, because birds do have the ability to go places where they want to be, but likewise, they also have the ability to go places where they don't want to be and leave those places. So finding a bird in a certain place at a certain time generally means that that bird chooses to be there, because it has the ability to choose to be there and it has the ability to leave somewhere, right? So that usually means that if a bird is found in a certain place for a certain period of time, that the resources that it needs, food, shelter, whatever it is that it's needing at that certain time, are available in those spots. Because if those resources are no longer available, the bird will just spread its wings and fly away, right? So because of that, birds are really good environmental indicators, and seeing birds in certain habitats in certain places can tell you a lot about whether that habitat is functional or not, whether that habitat is useful, whether that habitat is actually good for birds or not. So keeping that in mind, our staff has been really great at working in the city and really trying to sort of find and parse out the kind of biodiversity, the diversity of species that you can still find in Roger Tory Peterson's birthplace. But this is last year, last spring, we started doing organized bird walks on the new walking path, a bike path that the city of Jamestown had just created, about 3/4 of a mile long. An easy walk along the Shadquan River that really starts in the city and ends right on the border of the city. So you have 3/4 of a mile going through some grassland right along the river, all within city limits. At any point you can stop on the walk and you can just be quiet and you can hear the cars driving. And in most places you can actually see the trucks driving by just a block over. So any park, any city, USA pretty much. We started doing weekly walks and just identifying the birds that we were finding in this park. And without really even trying too hard, within one spring season, we had identified over 130 species of birds right in the city of Jamestown. Now, I would have asked anybody who came on these walks before we started how many birds they would think there would be in Jamestown. They probably would have said maybe a dozen, and half of them are pigeons and starlings. So doing these kind of walks right in the city and pointing out the kind of species that are there, people who otherwise wouldn't know that, really open their eyes, and it really speaks to that see it part that people just don't realize what's actually in their backyards anymore. And it includes amazing species, beautiful, beautiful birds like this rose-breasted grosbeak and Baltimore orioles, just gorgeous, gorgeous birds, hummingbirds, beautiful. And you know, you can blame people for not seeing hummingbirds, for example, or rose-breasted grosbeaks or orioles all the time because they're not there all the time. So being able to see these birds and also at some points not seeing them sort of begs the question, why are they here sometimes and why are they not? So that kind of inspires people to start to learn a little bit more about them and hopefully appreciate them a little bit more. I just wanted to share this picture with you. This is a picture I took earlier this year in January in the mountains of Costa Rica. And if you're familiar with your birds, you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 7 or 8 rose-breasted grosbeaks right there on the banana feeder. And there's a Baltimore oriole sitting on the diagonal beam right there. And then there's some tropical tanagers mixed in right there as well. So the reason why part of the year you don't see rose-breasted grosbeaks or Baltimore orioles or ruby-throated hummingbirds because they're not in Jamestown. They're somewhere completely different. They're migratory birds that spend part of their life somewhere else and visit during the summer. So it's important to understand and learn more about these birds so that we know how they're connected to other places as well. So even though these birds are important to your backyard in Jamestown, they're also important to other people's backyards in other parts of the world. All these backyards, all these different people that look at these birds might be thousands of miles apart sometimes. So this little bird right here is actually a ruby-throated hummingbird. And I caught this bird and banded this bird on January 26th in northwestern Costa Rica. So this is another little bird, a teeny tiny little bird that breeds in our backyard that you can see in a place like Jamestown and many other places in North America. But it's connected to other backyards in Central America. And amazingly, some of these birds fly on their own accord back and forth from our backyards in North America to their Central American or sometimes South American wintering ranges. And we know very, very little about that, apart from the fact that it's absolutely amazing. When you think about, for example, a ruby-throated hummingbird, male ruby-throated hummingbirds weigh about 4 grams. Adult male ruby-throated hummingbirds weigh about 4 grams. That's about the same weight as 2 pennies. So these teeny tiny birds with the weight of 2 pennies every year fly back and forth from North America to Central America, thousands of miles. And from doing banding studies in Central America, we know that some of these birds do this numerous times. Friends have actually banded a ruby-throated hummingbird, released it, and recaptured it several times year after year at a banding station in northwestern Costa Rica over a span of 9 years. So we know now for sure that these hummingbirds, these 2 flying pennies, like at least 9 times in a row, fly back and forth from Central America to our backyard, which is absolutely amazing. So just seeing these birds in your backyard in North America and wondering how they got there, where they came from, and really inspiring people to learn more about the biology of these birds really inspires people to better understand them and to care about them and hopefully protect them. And that's kind of another interesting facet too, in that we know quite a bit about the birds in our backyards in North America. And I don't know if Tom LeBlanc is on the Zoom right now. He otherwise would have been here, but I apologize in advance that I stole one of his Facebook pages. But there's a post here from Tom LeBlanc, who is one of the staff members at the Allegany Allegany State Park, where the program would be taking place right now. And he's a licensed avid bird bander, and he posted his picture a little while ago where he had caught a American redstart for 11 times now. This is the 11th time he caught exactly the same bird. And it's because these migratory birds actually come back to the same place every year to breed. So 11 times he's caught that same bird because it keeps coming back to the same place. And we really don't know a whole lot about the migratory patterns of these birds. So by the time they leave after the breeding season's over and they go back to their wintering grounds, we kind of like wave them off and wish them the best and keep our fingers crossed that they come back in the spring again. But we don't really know a whole lot of what happens in between. Well, having done banding studies in Central America for many, many years, we're starting to learn a little bit now too. And the most fascinating part of this is that not only do these birds return to their North American breeding grounds over and over again, same place, almost the same time most of the time, but it turns out that these birds don't just migrate quote unquote south, they actually migrate to very specific places down south. So for example, the picture of that golden winged warbler that you see below that, that's a bird that we captured and banded in Costa Rica in the rainforest as well. And we were able to band the bird, release it, and we've been able to recapture it for 3 years running. Every year we come back around the same time. We capture exactly the same bird at exactly the same spot, and more often than not, actually exactly the same net that's located by the same tree. So it shows you that these birds have really set ways and very specific destinations that they go to. And it's very important that we understand that and know where these places are so that we can protect them better. Because if we don't protect their wintering grounds, if we don't protect their migratory pathways, then these birds will not be coming back to our breeding sites in our backyard anymore. So this logical progression of seeing it, learning it, loving it, and protecting it really needs to be seen through from the beginning to the end. But it all starts with seeing it. I think that's something that we're doing more and more, trying to get people to see what's all in their backyards. It's amazing. It's amazing what you can find in Western New York, even just in the greater Jamestown area. So if you look at the yellow area, this map down below, that's Chautauqua Lake, and it drains through what we call the outlet forest into the Chautauqua River, which goes right through the middle of Jamestown. Chautauqua Lake is qualified as a important bird area, nationally recognized important bird area, because it's an important stopover site for wintering waterfowl. When the lake is not frozen solid, Ducks and geese and all kinds of waterfowl will spend time there because it's a critical stopover site on the migratory pathway from their wintering grounds to their breeding grounds, which tend to be north of us. So Chautauqua Lake, as are many, many, many other lakes, are really critical stopover sites for a lot of birds as they're passing through. And again, the same kind of questions. You can see these beautiful hooded mergansers and other waterfowl, but you can only see them for part of the year. So we're hoping that people start to realize that you can see these species here, but hopefully they'll start asking questions like, why can't I see them all the time? Where are they going? How are their lives structured? Where do they go? What do they need? And that's, I think, the power of a really good field guide. You know, when you start to see these different species that you've never seen before, these beautiful birds, and you pick up a Peterson guide, for example, and you identify and you put a name on it, and you're committed. You're starting to actually understand and know these animals a little bit better. And any good field guide should be able to allow you to identify something. But a great field guide is the one that then gets you to ask more questions, that gets you to understand these birds a little bit better and start to dig a little bit deeper into their lives. It's really amazing lately to be able to see so many bald eagles and osprey nesting all over town by now. I've been here for a few years by now, but I can see the difference even in the few years that I've been here and the number of osprey that are coming in. We're really starting to see changes. And again, like I said before, these birds are environmental indicators. It tells us that there are good things happening in our backyards. And not to digress too much, but Tory Peterson was actually instrumental in the discovery of the impact of DDT on birds. And when he lived in Connecticut, actually had an osprey nest in his backyard. And he, as the citizen scientist and the curious bird watcher that he was, noticed that they were trying to breed, but every time they would sit on the eggs and incubate, but they wouldn't hatch any young. And Peterson actually during World War II was also tasked with looking at the impacts of DDT on birds and other wildlife, and actually knew that there was a way that the DDT could impact the breeding success of these birds. So his observations of having osprey failing at nesting and other birds as well, he communicated to his friend Rachel Carson, and through his help and a lot of other observations from other folks around him, gradually the impact was becoming more clear that DDT was impacting especially the birds that were higher up in the food chain and were accumulating the DDT into their tissues, and ultimately led to like loss of calcium in the eggshells and cracking the eggs every time they tried to hatch young. Other birds, beautiful birds you can find around Jamestown are these bobolink, and bobolink are indicative of grassland areas. And historically, they were probably found in more prairie-like habitats, which are long gone by now. But you can still find surrogates of that. You can still find artificial prairies, if you will, in areas that are managed for different reasons. So for example, Jamestown Airport, we found out, has become a really, really great grassland bird area because the grass areas are constantly being mowed down and maintained to keep it as safe as an airport. And in recent years, we've had rare birds such as grasshopper sparrows, which is a rare bird around here, and even henslow sparrows breeding at our airport, which is only one of 2 known places in New York State where henslow sparrows have bred in recent decades. So our staff and interns have been working diligently for several years to try to figure out what kind of habitat requirements do these really rare birds have, and how can we somehow find ways to make the airport still function as an airport and still be safe, still have birds coming in safely, but also have planes coming in safely, and at the same time create habitat that would be helpful to actually allow rarer birds to breed there as well. One of the things that often happens mostly out of just sheer habit is that airport areas get mowed really short. They get mowed really closely to the ground because it's the safest way to get, obviously, planes in. And there are very strict rules to how short the grass needs to be close to the runway, and there are very strict rules about how close the grass needs to be a little bit farther away from the runway. But unfortunately, one of the side effects of making the entire airport completely looking like a lawn is that you're creating habitat for birds such as Canada geese, very large, heavy birds that will be grazing and just foraging right along the sides of the runways. And obviously then you have to start hazing those away every time a plane will come in or needs to get out. So there are definitely arguments to be made that mowing less and actually saving money in the right places where it can be done safely would actually discourage birds that would be a bigger threat to air traffic to live there. And at the same time, you could be creating habitat for much rarer birds that are otherwise not able to survive anywhere because their habitat doesn't exist anymore. So there are really great ways where you can try to weave nature into economic development or everyday life in ways that people don't even realize because they often don't see it. They don't really see what's happening around them. Downtown Jamestown doesn't look like the Amazon, doesn't look like a very nature-friendly area either. But you'd be amazed at how many different unusual and even in some cases at-risk species can be found in an area that looks like this. If you look to the right, you see that smokestack that's kind of jutting out there. That's the only remnant of an old factory that used to be there. The factory was removed decades ago. The smokestack is still standing as sort of a historical marker, but it's slated to come down at any point too. But that smokestack actually forms a critical roosting habitat for chimney swifts. And chimney swifts, just like several other birds like purple martins and common nighthawks, are what we call aerial insectivores. They're birds that fly around and catch insects on the wing. They pretty much fly around with their mouth open and try to catch everything that flies. And they're birds that have been hit really hard. Their population have declined tremendously for a number of different reasons. In most cases, habitat loss is a major factor in that, and in this case, the loss of breeding habitat or roosting habitat has a huge impact on the populations of these species. And another big factor in that is the decline in insects and flying insects, which really started with blanket spraying for gypsy moths decades ago. And night-flying insects often form a major part of the diet for especially the common nighthawks. These are all birds that historically nested in habitats that are really hard to come by now. Chimney swifts used to breed in hollowed out old trees, and most self-respecting forest managers wouldn't let their trees get so old anymore that they would get old and hollow. They would harvest them well before that so that the lumber is still usable. And as you remember from the earlier slides, most of the older trees had been removed about 100 or so, 150 years ago. And much of the forest habitat in the area has been pretty intensely managed ever since. So we don't really see any more big old hollow trees out here anymore. And chimney swifts have been able to actually secondarily move into people's chimneys in their smokestacks. They roost in large smokestacks in large numbers, and then they breed individually in pairs, obviously, in just your own chimneys and brick chimneys in people's homes. Purple martins have completely switched over to artificial habitats. Same kind of thing. They used to live in hollow trees. All those have been removed. And a long time ago, purple martins started to get adjusted to living in ornamental gourds that were put up by Native Americans, and birdhouses and now plastic artificial gourds have for 100% replaced all the breeding habitat for all the purple martins along the East Coast. So it's amazing to think that an entire species along the entire East Coast of North America is entirely reliant on human help on the provision of artificial nest cavities for these birds to survive. There are currently no known natural nests of purple martins along the East Coast of the United States, which is amazing because these are birds that 90% of the entire species breeds in the US, and all these birds rely on people to be able to survive. So when you think about the impact that a person can have on conservation, these are the kind of species that any one of us can make a huge difference for. If you're living in the right places and if you put up the right kind of accommodations for purple martins, and if you can have a successful colony going, then you're accomplishing something. You're actually adding new breeding habitat for an entire species that's completely depending on us to do so. And interestingly enough, the common nighthawks are birds that used to breed on very sparsely vegetated prairie habitat and gravel bars and gravel banks and sandy plains. And a lot of that is gone too, if not all of it. And just like the chimney swifts have adapted to human habitation and have gotten used to smokestacks and chimneys, nighthawks have actually secondarily adapted to nesting on gravel rooftops if they're big enough, like on a big factory, for example. it almost simulates the kind of habitat that they would have historically bred in, except it would have been a gravel bar near a river somewhere. So the picture I showed you earlier of downtown Jamestown actually has several old, mostly empty or abandoned factories in there that actually have breeding populations of common nighthawks on the roofs and chimney swifts right in the smokestacks. There are purple martin boxes all over the city that are sustaining these aerial insectivores. So I won't bore you with too much of the numbers, but if you look at the cumulative decline of these species since the start of the census that we are using to actually assess these populations, you'll see that chimney swifts as a species have declined 72% since the mid-1960s. So we've lost like 3/4 of our chimney swifts already in the last 60 or so years, 55, 60 years, and they continue to decline with several percentage points every year. So these are species that have been hit really hard. Their numbers are entirely decimated, and they're still declining every year. And they're completely relying on people to survive right now. They're relying on man-made habitats to survive. So these are the kind of species that we can really help. So it's important for us to make sure that people see this, learn from this, and care about it, and help us provide more homes and more nesting sites for these kind of birds. So we do a lot of work in the summer, banning all of the purple martins that we have around Chautauqua Lake and area to see if they come back to the same area to breed again. So we have a better understanding of how many birds we have in the area, and to see whether, for example, we need to put more nesting boxes up to make sure that we have more room for more young to come and colonize the areas right here. We're getting young people involved in all these different conservation questions that need to be answered, and try to figure out what's actually working in our backyard and what can we do to help. So not only do we survey birds, but we survey bats. We have students out at night with echo meters looking for bats and recording their calls, and we put up portable recorder devices so we can record the calls of the different bats that are flying over at night. So even in the pitch dark, we can record their calls, and we can identify which species are there based on different frequencies. We're surveying all of the city parks to see what kind of wildlife we can find in there. And again, this is just a city park right surrounded by roads on all sides. It's a little area that doesn't look like a whole lot, but the little snake in the foreground is a short-headed garter snake. And if you're from the area here, you've probably seen them before because they're not uncommon here. But it's actually one of the snakes in North America with the smallest distribution range of any species of snake here. So this is the only part of the planet where you can see this species. They're unique species that are only found in this region, and they're living right in our cities, and in most cases completely go unnoticed, unstudied, and uncared for. Giant snapping turtles, you know, if you catch one of these things in a river in a backyard, you'll never forget that. So these are really, really important moments for these students to get involved in these kind of studies. It's important for people to see how easy it is to miss some of these species. This is a red-bellied snake, a completely harmless little insectivore. And if you look at the little roly-poly bug right next to it, you'll see this is an adult snake. They're pretty easy to miss it unless you're really looking for them and in the right places. So it's important for us that we keep pointing this out to people, that there is so much more life in our backyards than we even know, because most people don't see it. Here's another shot of a real beautiful urban environment. You see another smokestack in the back. This was another factory that was removed several years ago. You can see how the mindset was 100 or so years ago, where factories were purposely built on or near rivers so that the water could power the factories, but also, as you can see in the lower picture, the river literally goes through the foundations of the factory. There used to be an entire factory hall built over top of the river. And you can totally picture how at the end of the day, people would open a trap door on the floor and they would just pick up the brooms and they'd sweep all the leftovers and whatever else they didn't want to deal with anymore, all the garbage, and just sweep it right through the trap door into the river. And it was a self-cleaning kind of system right there. So it worked great. And you can imagine that these rivers have seen quite a bit of abuse over the last 100 or so years. And when I first came to town, that was kind of the impression I got, that people were almost afraid of the river, that it was, everybody knew it was polluted, it had been contaminated with so much just residue from the industrial history of Jamestown. And just looking at it too, it looks like it's completely channelized, so it's hard to imagine that anything really lives in there. But after we started studying it a little bit more, we start to realize that this river is very much alive. And not just alive, but it's actually also home to several state-listed at-risk species. So far we've been able to find 5 different species of turtles in the river living right in the same areas that I just showed you, right in those, like between those old foundations, including these spiny softshell turtles, which is a species of special concern in New York State. And we probably have, based on the counts that we've gotten so far, I'm fairly certain that we have one of the largest, if not the largest, populations of spiny softshell turtles in New York State living right within the limits of Jamestown, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. They're literally right in downtown Jamestown. And the neat thing is that just as much as birds are good environmental indicators, turtles are as well. Obviously, turtles don't have wings, so they can't really fly away if they don't really like their situation. But what turtles do have is that they live for a very long time. And especially softshell turtles are extra interesting because, as their name implies, their shell is soft and leathery. It's not hard like in most terrestrial turtles and even some aquatic turtles. And it's soft for a few reasons. It's soft because it reduces weight, and these are really fast swimmers. If you look at this picture, you can see the big flippers on their front legs. They're really good at just kind of paddling through the water, and they can really motor. They're flat and streamlined like that and lightweight. But an interesting aspect of these turtles too is that even though they're reptiles, they almost act in some way as if they're amphibians too. Their leathery shell actually allows them to exchange gases and fluids through the shell and through the skin. So they're capable of absorbing a lot of the oxygen that they need to supply their system through their skin, and they can stay underwater for a very long time. But it also means that they can only survive in waters that are very rich in oxygen, that are highly oxygenated. So that's something that tells us if you find spiny softshell turtles in a river, it tells you that the water is clean and oxygenated, because these are turtles that need those high oxygen levels. And also chemicals can go through their skin. So if they would live in contaminated waters, chemicals would have been building up over time. These are turtles that can live 30, 40, 50, maybe 60 years. So they would be accumulating a lot of chemicals as well over their lifespan. So finding especially larger, older softshell turtles in a specific river or a lake will tell you that lake has been clean of to sustain these populations for a long time. So that's a really good indicator of the aquatic health of that system. One of the most amazing things to me is that these turtles are so adept at absorbing oxygen from their environment, from the water, that they actually, like most other turtles, hibernate underwater. And they pretty much bury themselves into the mud, and they get enough oxygen throughout the winter to actually survive and just wake up in the spring and regain their active patterns again. And they mostly go down sometime in September, depending on the weather, and they just started emerging in the last few weeks again. So somewhere between September and May, these turtles are underwater, buried in the mud, holding their breath, and able to survive for months because they live in areas that have enough oxygen in the water. So spiny softshell turtles, really good environmental indicators. So seeing these turtles in huge numbers living in a river that looks completely channelized tells a whole different story than what people are telling me. You know, even though it looks really industrial and even though it has been polluted, the wildlife living in this river tells me that the water actually is really clean. The infrastructure may be old and it might be crumbling and it might be very industrial, but the actual system is really, really sound. And the same goes for other animals. Salamanders, incredible environmental indicators. Salamanders are actually critical in breaking down and actually eating small invertebrates that help break down leaf litter. And if you have a healthy salamander population, it means that it would suppress the population of these little shredders, these little invertebrates that break down leaf litter. And it would mean that leaf litter would actually take much longer to decompose and actually become soil and gets buried into the forest, rather than being shredded to the point that it's so small that a lot of the carbon from the leaves actually becomes airborne. So salamanders actually are not just really cool, but they'll actually play a very important role in climate buffering and may actually help sequestering carbon into the forest soil. Now, salamanders are species that are often at risk because they're also very sensitive to environmental issues. They're sensitive to air pollution, they're sensitive to water pollution, and they're hiding. They're under logs, they're underground. People don't see them unless they're really looking for them. And if you live in areas where you have a lot of invasive plant species, and especially garlic mustard, you'll start to see that salamanders are disappearing. And then when you're flipping logs and rocks to look for salamanders underneath them, instead of finding salamanders, you'll be finding night crawlers and large worms. Garlic mustard, an invasive plant species that I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir here again. A lot of you have been pulling these in your spare time in the last few weeks. It's a species that can get out of control, and it's a species that can get out of control because it exudes chemicals from its roots that helps it outcompete other species of plants. It allows other garlic mustard plants to grow in its proximity, but it kills other plants that try to grow there. So if you have garlic mustard in your backyard for too long, it changes the soil chemistry to the point that all you're going to have is garlic mustard for a long time. And unfortunately, it also changes the soil chemistry to the point that salamanders can no longer live in those areas. Woodland salamanders get pretty much driven out of their homes and sadly then replaced by invasive earthworms that were actually native to the same area where garlic mustard originally came from in Eurasia. So invasive species have a big impact on species too. And when you talk about salamanders and how these invasive species, like one particular plant like garlic mustard, could have a whole cascading effect through the ecosystem where it competes with other plants, it changes the soil chemistry, it moves the salamanders. The salamanders will then not feed on the little shredders, and more of the leaf litter that's in the ground will actually end up becoming atmospheric carbon. You can tell that all these things are interestingly related, but also importantly related, and very important for us to understand how to better preserve our backyards. I just have to throw this one in there because this is actually a non-native orchid that shows up all in our backyards. It's a Helleborine orchid. Not every single non-native plant species is necessarily invasive and detrimental. This is a species that doesn't seem to be competing with a whole lot of other species. But it doesn't belong here and it shows up. Other species impact other plants again. Hemlock woolly adelgid, a little aphid, that's been killing off our hemlock trees in the backyard that we're surveying everywhere. We have a lot of citizen science programs running to keep an eye on the spread of hemlock woolly adelgid in the region. We've been recently hit hard with emerald ash borer, which also has killed all of our ash trees, which is obviously horrible. But in the last year or two, we're seeing a major boom in woodpeckers because there's so many dead standing trees right now, and there's so many grubs living in the trees that it's just a bonanza for woodpeckers. All these different things are related. And native insects are also taking a hit. You hear it everywhere. And it's one of these species, monarch butterflies, luckily, is something that's a species that's charismatic enough, that's iconic enough. People notice those. They see them, they care about them, they're willing to do something about them, they're willing to learn, to see what it is that they can do by, for example, planting more native milkweeds to help these monarchs. But just like with the birds, the monarchs migrate too, so you need to help them in your own backyard. You also need to understand how your backyard is connected to other people's backyards so that we can connect them through their entire range and protect them so they can still come back. And other native insects are also fascinating. This is a species of butterfly called the red-spotted purple, or sometimes called the white admiral. Historically, this was actually thought to be two different species, and they were thought to be completely isolated. One is a northern species, one is more found in southern states. But last year, by pure chance, I actually caught both of these in my backyard, both the northern and the southern variety. And we're learning more and more that these are actually not two different species, but actually one more widespread species that has two very different appearances in different parts of the country. And apparently the two ranges are meeting now and they're hybridizing in certain areas, including right here in our backyards. And dragonflies, we've been studying those too. They're full of all kinds of interesting habitat specialists. This is a great petaltail. This is one of the rarest dragonflies in New York State. We recently found those here in Chautauqua County too. I think the nearest population known is about 500 miles away. It's one of the most primitive dragonflies left alive at this point, and there are only 4 species in that same group left on the planet. Recently, we started a new project where we're actually looking at dragonfly diversity and damselfly diversity in city parks again, using students to actually help identify the different species and collect them. We're also looking at how microplastics are now traveling through the ecosystem. We're looking at how species that start their life in the water, like dragonflies and damselflies, actually accumulate microplastics from the water and retain those as they metamorphose into a flying adult, and then take those plastics with them and embed it into their tissues. So apart from even just the biology of these species, it's almost impossible not to just be struck by how incredibly beautiful these species are too. So thinking about the artistic value of all these species too, if you just spend a couple of days out in the field catching damselflies, and you can literally find a true rainbow of different damselflies right in your backyard, that is pretty amazing and pretty beautiful. So what are we going to do with those superpowers? How do we get people to actually use them some more? So we're getting kids outside as much as possible. We're primarily focused on slightly older students, high school ages, when they're really starting to think about a career in biology or arts or education. And we get them involved trying to figure out what kind of meaningful conservation solutions we can design and develop right here in our backyards, and how can we implement them. So they help us with invasive species removal, putting out bird boxes. We have art classes and nature journaling classes. We really would like to see the green spaces in Jamestown, and not just in Jamestown, but it's meaningful here in Jamestown because these are the same kind of green spaces, these same kind of remnants, patches of green that once upon a time inspired a writer, Tory Peterson. We'd like those green spaces to be functional as green spaces, to be places where people can just relax and truly see nature. And in a lot of cases, there are ways you can recreate natural areas that can actually be economically beneficial, that also save the city money, for example, in terms of maintenance and such. And it's just really important to get kids outside and have them help with these kind of things. Because if you don't, you're going to run into all kinds of problems. Not building properly managed lake shores and river banks will cause erosion problems. And so we're helping different entities in the region, including the city of Jamestown, to rebuild some of these banks and do it right. So we're building new river banks, and we're making them permeable. We make sure that we take care of stormwater management systems so that they don't wash away again. And we're building in nesting beaches for turtles, so that there's something interesting to see for people when they walk around there again. And that's, I think, one of the hardest things to talk about right now for me, because as you can imagine, this year we are not able to do any of our student engagement projects in the summer, but it's always one of my favorite times of the year, where in the summer we run our Project Wild America Youth Ambassadors program, where we truly have local high school students work with us as our conservation technicians and outreach technicians, and as true ambassadors for the community, to actually help us figure out what kind of information do we need about our city. What do we really need to learn about the green spaces and the rivers and everything that lives in the city, so we can be smart about how we plan the future for the city and for the population here, so we can do it right. So they help us catching turtles and looking for soft-shell turtles and other species. They help us banning birds so that we have a better understanding of which birds breed in our city parks, which birds are just migrants, and which birds are making exotic journeys to Central and South America and come back a year later to see if the park is still there. We're staining for microplastics, and we're looking for aquatic invasive species. We're trying to get our students to really get a chance to see the entire breadth of all the different work that needs to be done to really do conservation right. And with it, of course, comes, again, our need to make people see it and educate people about our backyards, because that's where we live. That's where we need to actually learn what we're dealing with. If everybody was more aware of what lived in our backyards, I think we'd be looking at a very different world here. And it's our backyard. So if anyone's going to get to know it, it's going to be us. So we're really counting on everybody to be part of this and really become our eyes and ears. So what started almost 100 years ago now with Roger Tory Peterson using our backyards, my backyard, Jamestown, Western New York backyards, as an inspiration for funneling his artistic skills into tools that can educate literally millions of people about life in their own respective backyards. It's something that we try to continue still. You know, I do it with my own kids. You know, we're constantly looking at what lives in our backyards. But interestingly enough, I just lifted us from the New York Times page today. Thinking about Roger Tory Peterson's field guide, his first field guide coming out in 1934 in the Great Depression. You know, like I said, like a time when you think that people would have other things on their minds than looking at nature in their backyard. Now that we're all homebound and we're all locked in and looking for things to do, it seems like birding is having a real resurgence again. And it's really amazing to see how many people suddenly are buying field guides and joining bird clubs and joining Audubon societies and helping support conservation efforts. And, you know, citizen science portals like eBird and iNaturalist are going off the rails. So many people are submitting sightings right now that a lot of these sites can't even handle the volume of information that's coming in. So as bad as things get, and as much as I think we've distanced ourselves from nature, it's so encouraging to see that this is just around the corner and it's actually still possible to get people excited. Just taking out a field guide and looking at your window and looking at your backyard and learning what's there, and hopefully loving it and hopefully wanting to protect it. So if you're not into birds, frogs are great too. We really like frogs. You don't have to love frogs just this much, but there's all kinds of things for anybody here. If you're interested in insects, if you're interested in any kind of animal or plant group, there are other groups just like here at the Nature Pilgrimage that are interested in helping people hone their skills and get better at identifying different creatures and different plants and finding more ways to and spreading more information so that you care about these organisms more and more and hopefully protect them better. So as hard as these times are, I'm hoping that there's still a silver lining and all of us are going to come out stronger and more connected to nature again. Because we all have the superpowers. They might be all different. We may not all be Roger Tory Peterson. We may not all be able to paint and draw like he can. But find your skill and find your superpowers and go look at your backyard and learn as much as you can and share it with the world. And once it's safe to do so again, I really hope that all of you will come and visit us at the Roger Tory Peterson Institute in Jamestown as well. Beautiful place, we have beautiful art, and we have beautiful trails, all kinds of wonderful things to explore in the region. So I'm hoping to see a lot of you, not just through my computer screen at some point, but hopefully in real life out there in nature sometime. And that's what I had. I was wondering if anybody had any questions.
If you'd like to go ahead and unmute, we did. Hey, real quick, Twan, we had a hello from Lisa Gromley. Said
Yeah.
hi from Bendigo in Victoria, Australia.
Oh, that's awesome. Wow, that's amazing.
We had a gentleman that was one of your students in the picture, Alex Shepard, who's down in the Shenandoah Valley now in Virginia, said hello.
Oh, awesome. I actually see him right below me right now.
And Jane Derry, to everyone, I am in Panama. So.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. It's great to see this many people tuning in, and it's so weird to do this through a computer screen, not in front of people, but I'm so excited to see this many people tune in, and it's great to see that the Allegany Nature Pilgrimage is still a success.
And if anybody has a question, feel free to unmute and go ahead and fire away with a question. Any questions? Twan, one thing I'll say personally is I'm going to have to double down on my the garlic mustard out there in my backyard. I've got a couple acres. I live just west of Philadelphia, and I've always been blessed to have salamanders in the back. But that garlic mustard is an overtime job.
It is, isn't it? And it's overwhelming because there's so many invasives that just take over your backyard. You know, I'm slightly partial to salamanders, so that's the first one that has to go. It's worth it. It really, if you're going to tackle an invasive, that's probably one of the easiest ones to pull. And the sooner you get to it and the more you get to it, the more of an impact you'll have. There have been several studies where even if you've had garlic mustard for several years running and you remove it wholesale, it still takes years before you start to see some natural vegetation come back. So if you can keep it at a distance, it's worth doing that.
Yeah, we have a lot of battles here. I found a great recipe for pesto with young garlic mustard leaves,
Yes.
and then I tried grinding up the seeds and making them into mustard. That was a little rough. So
Yeah, it's great to get creative. We've done some like cookouts with all kinds of invasives, and it's amazing what you can do with some of it.
any questions?
I have
I
a
have
question.
a question. Oh, go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
I have in a humongous tree in my backyard about 50 feet from my house, nesting. My next door neighbor says they're Cooper's hawks. There's a male and a female. I think the male has a wingspan of about, oh my gosh, it looks like 3 to 4 feet, although they're very elusive. The female is a lot younger, and other than lawnmowers, there's not a lot of traffic on my street. I'm in a city, a small city, a suburb of Buffalo, and the squawking and the different noises that these birds make is absolutely fascinating when there's, depending on what's going on. And one thing I noticed was when there's other, they must be predatory birds. Mostly cardinals and blue jays have cleared the entire neighborhood of every other bird, and they're trying to, I think, get at that hawk's nest. The nest is ginormous. I can't see it anymore because it's covered with leaves. My question is, these birds get very upset every time my dog goes in the backyard, every time a lawnmower goes. I mean, they're living in the middle of a city, basically, and I'm not far away from an airport where huge jets are probably going to be flying over again soon, and I'm very worried about these birds. Is there anything that I can do other than trying not to make a lot of noise myself to help protect them? I think they're hawks. They're beautiful.
It sounds like there's some sort of hawk, and I'm glad to hear that you're enjoying having them. It's hard. It's hard. You know, a lot of birds will nest, and a lot of birds will fail, especially if they're young birds and it's their first time nesting. They might build a nest in a place that's not perfectly suited. But you'd be amazed at how adaptable some of these species are. And we're in our area here, we're seeing a huge increase in the number of merlin nests, which is a small falcon. We're in the middle of a breeding bird atlas effort right now, and there was one done about 10 years ago, and they actually put a picture of a merlin on the cover of the breeding bird atlas because it was a new bird for New York State. Now there are probably a dozen nests here in Jamestown, as far as I know, or maybe even more. They just moved in, and they're all in the city, in the most urban environments possible. Osprey, the same thing. They seem to nest right in the middle of parking lots sometimes, and they seem to be fine with that. In a way, sometimes some of these birds seem to get some protection from being near people too, because other predators that might prey on something as big as a hog may not feel comfortable being close to people as well. So it's kind of a toss-up. I will just let it ride and see what happens. I think that you're doing everything right, trying to minimize the disturbance. But if they've truly completed building a nest and it seems like they're sitting on eggs, then they probably managed to be okay this long, and they'll probably be fine. It's hard to tell whether the young are going to survive, and it takes one cat or some other predator to come in and end the whole story right there. But I think all you can do is just let it ride. And
it's amazing how many animals are in that tree, because you know, when I was watching the nest before all the leaves came in, to see like the chipmunks and the squirrels and the different kinds of birds that were in that tree with them, and then this huge nest, and they were foraging pieces of twigs and leaves and mud and everything from very close to my house. So I'd see them swooping down. Oh my gosh. just so awesome. And you know,
That's amazing.
it made me so appreciative. And the stuff that you told us tonight, I am so glad I watched you. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, it sounds like you have the right backyard to enjoy. So I hope you
I
can
really
enjoy it for
am.
much longer.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question.
Sure.
I have a pair of red-tailed hawks that have nested just across the street from my house in a quiet neighborhood. But the blue jays are constantly, all day long, attacking them. They're dive bombing them, and they actually hit them. But the hawks don't seem to do anything in return. It's probably a territorial thing. But why do the hawks not chase the blue jays off?
Yeah, red-tailed hawks primarily eat mammals. The Cooper's hawks that were mentioned earlier, they're more predators, so they would actually go after birds. Red-tailed hawks tend to go for squirrels and other mammals, so they're mostly just being annoyed by the blue jays. They probably wouldn't even be fast enough to catch one if they tried. It is amazing to watch. I remember watching snowy owls in the winter, and they just sit out exposed half the time. And of course, they're owls, so they're nocturnal. So during the day, they're out in exposed spots. And just about any bird that flies by suddenly does a double take when they see a snowy owl sitting there, and they just go back and harass it for a while because they don't like to have predators in their backyard. So you see these owls, these giant owls, just sitting there during the day trying to sleep, and they're constantly being harassed and hit by other birds, and it doesn't seem to faze them. It's amazing. Yeah, I would get pretty annoyed pretty quickly. But yeah, especially blue jays, they're really good at drawing attention to other raptors too. And crows do the same thing. If you hear a loud rocket somewhere, often like when a great horned owl or a barred owl will be sitting in a tree somewhere, and one crow finds it, it'll tell all its friends, and they'll all be all over it. That's often a good way to find them.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions? We got his attention.
Have you found any good spots for bobolinks and grasshopper sparrows yet up there this year?
Yeah, so the airport has been good. The bobolinks are back in. There's definitely also meadowlarks up there. I did get some grasshopper sparrows early on, but I'm not sure if they will be nesting this year. It depends on how the mowing schedule will end up at the airport this year.
I've been working with 2 interns down here through the Smithsonian Conservation and Biology Institute with Dr. Amy Johnson, who's really good at grassland bird conservation management. And we've found this site, it's protected by a permanent conservation land easement as an important bird area because they're actively managing all of their fields for specific habitat. And we found at least 15 bobolink nests all within a pretty small field, and they're packed right in there, which is pretty interesting because nest searching is very difficult. And it's pretty interesting how many grassland birds are all packed right in there. Red-winged blackbirds are a little bit more spread out, but we've been finding, I mean, amazing why the bobolinks prefer this area versus another area. And most of it's all fescue, which is just active cattle pasture. They've been doing different practices where they have cattle graze for a month and they remove the cattle, let the grass grow back up, so they still have time to nest if they'd like to. So it's really interesting to see different management practices, how they can have an effect on grassland species.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then, like I mentioned earlier, like a lot of the grassland species are obviously no longer living in natural grasslands. They're living in abandoned farm fields and areas like that. And even hay fields in most cases are just fine if they're the right size, if they're big enough. In most cases, they will support decent-sized grassland bird populations. The problem is that hay fields are obviously not managed for birds; they're managed for hay. So, if you're managing a hay field, you're trying to get as much hay off it as possible. And most farmers will get 3 or 4 cuttings out of it in a year. And generally, that means that one of these cuttings will take place right in the middle of the nesting season. So, the challenge for grassland birds is that it's not so much that there isn't enough habitat, suitable habitat anymore, but it's finding suitable habitat that doesn't get intensively cut, intensively managed so that they can actually make it through a breeding season and actually fledge their young. That's the biggest challenge. But setting aside a grassland and not cutting it also doesn't work, because after a year or two, the grassland will turn into scrub and little trees will start to grow in, and then it's no longer suitable for grassland. So you have to manage grasslands to make sure that they're still suitable for grassland birds. It's just a very different management practice than just farming it or just haying it. And it does mean that if this is a hayfield, that you would have to lose some revenue. You have to hay less, you have to cut less if you want your grassland birds to survive. And most farmers are not able or willing to do that. So there are good ways with conservation incentives to really boost the population of grassland birds by, offsetting the revenue losses for people who would lose on one kind of hay, for example. When you think about where conservation dollars go, those are the kind of things that really help. Building purple martin gourds and putting them in the right places helps, because you're helping a population that otherwise has nowhere else to go. And paying a farmer to hay not as frequently helps, because the birds will actually be able to fledge their young for a year, and you can actually really increase the population pretty quickly. It's important to ask those kind of questions. It always comes down to dollars and cents in the end. But those are the kind of places that are really worthwhile putting some conservation dollars.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of work with American kestrels too, and we're finding that the populations, in terms of providing natural nest boxes, is actually working, because they're starting to find that young that are banded over the mountain are actually starting to move further south. So there's so many cavities and they're all occupied. They're actually having to seek out new cavities. That's how well it's working. We banded probably about close to 60 young kestrels today.
Wow.
Just between probably 2 counties. This guy that works for the national park has about 250 nest boxes between American kestrels and barn owls that he's installed in only 2 years, and he has people that actively monitor them. But this is one of the best years they've seen for American kestrels in all the years that they've done for the past 3 years. So it's looking like it's really a good year for kestrel hatchlings.
That's fantastic. I have to point out that Alex is actually one of our he's one of those students who was actually one of my pictures seining for turtles in the river. He's one of our Project Wild America Youth Ambassador. He was one of our crew leaders and has been an intern at RTPI during part of his college education. So it makes me very happy to see him now working in grassland birds and rescuing kestrels out there.
If everyone else too it's still online, we're going to try to make these available recordings. We're going to try to upload these to our YouTube channel sometime next week. We're downloading them now and should make them available early next week. So you can review in detail some of Twan's slides.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it.
Sounds good. Twan, thank you very much. If anybody has any questions once he leaves, feel free to send an email to virtualanp, Allegheny Nature Pilgrimage, virtualanp@gmail.com, and we'll make sure that he gets those questions and can respond to you. All right? Thank you very much. And good night, everybody. We do have one more program in another hour or so at 9:30 this evening, Nature at Night. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Wonderful. Have a good night.